Imagine a museum that is more than a place you drag your family to on Sundays. A museum that engages community members in unpacking the meaning of our collective history. You may not have to leave your home to visit this museum of the future. The museum may actually be a feature of the affordable housing where you live. In this time of change, we are seeing that the more we prioritize equity, access, and community needs, the closer we get to this future museum.
Welcome to Augmented Humanity. Our guests are modern explorers working at the intersection of technology and the humanities. They help us to understand ourselves and the worlds we create in this digital age. They are thinkers, creators, makers, and academics working in diverse fields like linguistics, technology, game and object design, and ethics. I'm your host, Craig Goldsmith.
I'm your host, Ellen Dornan.
On this program, we're speaking with John Voss, a founding member of Shift Collective, a nonprofit consulting and design group focused on community-driven design for social change. Shift creates equity-based programs and tools to help organizations better engage and reflect their local communities. We're also joined by Monique Davis. Monique is chair and president of the Shift Collective board, as well as managing director of the Center for Art and Public Exchange at the Mississippi Museum of Art. CAPE seeks to use original artworks, exhibitions, programs, and artist engagement to increase understanding and inspire new narratives in contemporary Mississippi. So, John and Monique, if you could tell us a little bit about Shift Collective and a little bit about CAPE, just to give our listeners an idea of what these organizations are about and what kind of activities you're engaged in.
Shift Collective is something that's brand new launched. It's been an evolution over many years. We worked in collaboration with a group, Shift Foundation in the UK, over many years. And over the past 5 years or so, we've been really focused on our work with the US team on equity initiatives in the United States. A lot of field building, bringing together people to talk about the future of cultural memory, and particularly the lack of representation in a lot of the mainstream organizations, as well as the importance of building on those institutions that are actually rooted in community, in which you'll find in any town, city, locality across the United States. That's really our emphasis and our focus. The other piece about it, I would say, is that it's been really important for us in recent years to better understand how nonprofits work and what it means to be post-capitalist in our approach to that, and what it means to have non-hierarchical leadership, and to really embody the change that we think is necessary to create equitable institutions.
Do you have anything to add to that, Monique?
Yeah, I would say that I was honored when John asked me to be on the board of Shift, and we met in New Orleans, open sourced conference with lots of librarians, archivists thinking through what equity-based organizing and archives look like in a non-extractive economy. And I was just really impressed by the work that he was doing. And because I am also an aggressive participator, when the opportunity came to be on his board, I said yes. Our friendship and relationship has continued to deepen as we learn more about doing this work together.
The Shift Collective started in the UK, so it's like a global effort.
Shift Foundation is an organization in the UK, and in the early days, I was a consultant for the Shift Foundation, and I worked primarily on the project History Pin, which is a massive community-led mapping platform. It's really all about building community around local history. That was my focus from 2011 on to 2015, and so when we started to build our team and look at some other projects specific to the US. And so Shift Design Inc. was our US 501c3 nonprofit. We really started to focus on things much more specific to the US. A lot of the work that we do now is around field building, consultancy to work with organizations to look at how to better engage their communities, and to do that with a design perspective to it.
You both used a phrase, equity engagement. What would that mean in lay terms?
When I say equity, I mean that the people who are impacted are at the table. They are part of the construction of the solution, and it's not somebody coming in and having to fulfill some specific grant outcomes and coming in to fix it. That the people that are impacting it are part of the solution because they're living it. Equity means that you are doing whatever's necessary to get people towards liberation or what their desired outcome is.
I think that's a great place to start because that is such a critical piece of what we're dealing with right now. In our sector, cultural memory, we are dealing with massive amounts of inequity. We're dealing with a structure that's set to extract. We come at it from a design perspective and look at how those systems were created, what they've been created to do, and how to design something else. Even collecting old photos and putting them on a map or collecting stories, that's an extractive process that doesn't compensate people or take into account historical trauma or other elements of it too. And so this is something that we've really been learning to practice and coming up with methodologies and how to do that. So when we talk about equity, it does mean all these things. It does mean getting caught up to a place where everybody has this equal opportunity. Equity also means money. That's the other meaning of equity. Whenever we're dealing with how to get to a point where we're looking at fairness, where we're looking at people being treated the same, we're talking about dealing with historical harm and trauma, and we're talking about ultimately a transfer of wealth that's going to be required to get there.
To do a riff off of what John said, when I think of equity, I'm talking about reparations conversations. And so possibly that some people should be paid more than other people because of historical trauma and privilege.
I'm getting the approach and the ethos. So, can either or both of you speak to a specific project that sort of might embody these kinds of traits?
I love your intro, Ellen. It was this great concept of imagining what museums could potentially be. And I think a lot of people think of museums as community centers. I don't think that's what they are. I don't think that's what they were designed to be. However, many community centers actually are museums. And I think that's the pivot. And so I think of a lot of examples. I live in New Orleans. I moved here 4 years ago, and I'm in love with the culture of New Orleans, the music, the food, and particularly the history and the ongoing fight for justice that has been going on here for hundreds and hundreds of years. One of the things that's absolutely fascinating to me is this ecosystem of cultural memory organizations that exist in New Orleans. You know, you can look at it in terms of the history since pre-Katrina, post-Katrina, that's a big dividing line. You can look at pre-slavery, post-slavery, that's another dividing line. You can look at pre-colonialism, post-colonialism. Those are all lines that are very much visible in New Orleans and in the streets today. But there's been this constant, persistent resistance and positivity that existed outside of the economic channels that were allowed for some people to participate in and some that aren't. You have things like social aid and pleasure clubs here, which support organizations and people who were left out of that economy and created for themselves. And in a way that they had their own autonomy, they had their own self-determination. And those still exist today. They're very much alive today in the second line traditions, the music traditions, the jazz funeral. All of that is where that comes from. And so to me, when you look at organizations like the Shea Cultural Arts Center, Backstreet Cultural Museum, you know, these are institutions that are focused on the people and the communities in New Orleans. Tourists can come there, but that's not who it's for. It's for these people in this organization, in this neighborhood, in this community. And that's what I think of when I think of museums.
Monique, your organization, the Center for Art and Public Engagement, is part of the Mississippi Museum of Art, which is sort of the big museum there. How is the work you're doing shifting from a place of hollowed collections where you can go and sort of admire the pretty things that are there to a place that builds equity within your community?
CAPE stands for the Center for Art and Public Exchange, and it is a Kellogg-funded initiative that uses art and engagement with artists to talk about issues of race and equity. And as a result of the programming that we have done, our audience has diversified because we are talking about issues that are relevant to our audience. And so, just to give you some background, Jackson is a blue bubble in a sea of red in the state of Mississippi. In Jackson, it's 80% African American, with a large percentage of those households earning less than $30,000 a year. So, the urban center in Jackson is relatively poor, and it gets whiter and wealthier as you move to the outer rings of Jackson. And so our primary museum audience in the past has been a highly educated, middle-aged white woman earning $60,000 to $75,000 a year. And so when Kellogg approached us, they were advancing this idea of racial reconciliation. And they said, how are you going to move the needle on this reconciliation conversation, and who's your core audience? And our case statement was that the way to move the needle was was to start having these courageous, brave, compassionate conversation with white folks because racism is a thinking issue that lives inside of white folks. The idea was to have these great pieces of art that provoked these conversations in a diverse community and have people see and experience their shared humanity while looking at a piece of art and having an enlightening conversation. If it could shift their perspective just a little bit to see each other in a new light, then our job would have been done. And so CAPE is about creating the platforms using art as that anchoring object for those things to happen. And I think it is happening. But transformation is a hard thing to measure. It has been a journey for us to figure out how to evaluate that transformation. But I think this moment in time, people really willing to have that conversation in ways that they weren't necessarily 2 or 3 years ago. Because 3 years ago, I was still gently debating with people that racism still is a thing.
I'm struck by what both of you are saying, that you're still feeling your way through building these models for other people. You're still finding out what works. And it's a little surprising that this work is so new.
If we had a solution in place,
You would have done it.
like we wouldn't be burning the streets down right now. This has been so many hundreds of years in the making. First of all, I want to say Monique and I are a really good representation in that instance of the inside-outside game. I don't do very well working on the inside. I don't feel like that's a place where I can be constructive, actually. So there's a great study by Helicon Collaborative called Not Just Money. Their belief was that if you could actually study and show people what the reality of arts and culture funding is, and you looked boldly at where that money was going, so 58% of all the arts and culture funding is going to 2% of the organizations that have $5 million or more in their budgets. Well, if we could just point that out, then obviously it would change. And so they put this study out in 2014. They brought it to all the funders. Everyone was shocked. In 2017, when they re-released that study, they found that not only had it not gotten better, it had gotten worse. And so it's not enough just to point out the fact that this inequity exists, but we actually have to redesign the systems in which we work. And it's not enough to just change the people who are on your board. It's not enough to change the holdings that are in your collections. It's not enough to change how you collect. It really is about coming down to better ways to work together that are not extractive, that actually pay people for their contributions, and that refocuses on the entirety of the history and the entirety of the people who live in this country together.
But getting a more diverse board and expanding your collection, all those things are also important.
That's right. But I'm not going to be on the inside trying to do that, because I'm not waiting for that. If you're going to wait the 20 years that it takes to change your board and then the 50 years that it takes to change your collections, well, I'm not waiting for that.
John, you have such a low opinion of the museum field.
I will confess to saying, it's true. I'm kind of a history buff, but I do feel like the art museum is where art goes to die. I'm sorry to say it.
I did want to circle back, Monique, to something you said with some of your work with CAPE, where you were trying to do engagements and programs that would get people talking about issues of history and race and conflict. Did you have cases where this actually happened? Were there people that got really intensely worked up, both positively and negatively, perhaps?
I would say that people learned something that they didn't know before. In some cases, wanted to be advocates for the cause. So one of them was we had a contemporary Chickasaw exhibit and we had a CDIB card on display. That stands for Certificate Degree of Indian Blood. And it was made as a centerpiece of a necklace. And we had a predominantly white audience there talking about the object and looking at the object. And one, most people don't know that that exists. And two, one of the participants said, I am from German ancestry, and I just cringe at the fact that somebody has to certify who they are as a person, and nobody asked me for that information. The cogs in her brain started to connect and say that this is what one human being is living through. And because of the privilege of my white skin, this is something that I don't have to deal with, but I appreciate understanding somebody else's perspective. And that's just one example of many. I mean, we had one about immigration where we had somebody from the UK, somebody that was recipient of DACA, because I wanted to show that the complexity of immigration impacts people that aren't always brown. I mean, and she was saying how she had to recertify her worker status and how long it took her to get her worker's permit. And so it humanized it to a predominantly white audience. They didn't realize how complicated it was. They didn't realize how expensive it was, what a hardship it was. And this was a conversation held in front of a painting by MacArthur Binion called DNA number 4, which were strips of his birth certificate. He had pieces of those in like a huge grid pattern. And you looked closely and you could see on it that it had said colored. And so it also talked about identity, documentation, migration, how people move through spaces. And so those are some of the conversations that are happening when art is an anchoring object and when people don't feel shame. Because I always say you can't shame people into epiphanies. You can't shame people into a change of behavior. You have to have these conversations with a sense of humanity.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
John and Monique, I know that you've done a lot of work here in New Mexico with your community-centered design approach, engaging stakeholders to determine different needs. Do you want to talk a little bit about what it looks like in New Mexico versus, say, in New Orleans or Mississippi?
I wanted to tell you a story about a project that we worked on with New Mexico Highlands University. It was a Mellon-funded project, and we had this idea. There was this amazing collection of Farm Security Administration photos from the 1930s. Most people have seen these really iconic photographs by some amazing photographers, John Collier, Dorothea Lange, many others. So we had this idea of bringing these photos and kind of collecting, gathering stories around them. And that's the sort of point of extraction in which we started. Like, how could we actually make this more of a sharing experience? And we had a 5-day planning grant. And so we were ready to dive deep in with local community organizers. We had national thought leaders. And I'll never forget having spent weeks planning for this 1 week on the ground. Monique was there too. And we presented this idea of how we were going to do it. We're going to start workshopping. It was this great design session. And thankfully, Monique had interrupted and said, well, let's start with some norms. Like, let's have some agreements on how we're going to talk with each other. That turned out to be a very important thing. You kind of think that's going to be an emergency thing or something, but like laying those down turned out to be so important, because by the time we got to the afternoon of the first day and everybody broke out in these groups and we were doing this design workshop, everyone was like, this is not going to work. This is ridiculous. Like, we had this plan to go drop into Taos and extract all these stories. And everyone on the ground was like, you can't just go and ask people to give their stories. Do you not understand the historical trauma that's happened there? And fortunately, because I think we had opened the space in a way that we could say, if you don't agree, we can talk about that. And people just put the brakes on it. My colleague Burgess Jules was one of them and said, this is not going to work. And so I think if we had been a traditional academic collaborative, we probably would have said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And what happened was, instead of testing out this pilot and bringing it to that community, we had this amazing experience that was designed by the people in the community. There was music there, there was dancing. We didn't bring any of those tools. Like, that came from the community itself. And then it became this thing where we were introducing them to these photographs and trying to understand what it is they thought was important or not important about those. What stories did they tell, or what stories did they exclude? And what would that become? And then that eventually became the Manitos Project. To me, that's the future of what community engagement looks like. That you can't just extract either time or resources or stories without really compensating people for their experience, for their input, and to make sure that they're a part of the production and design of the whole thing.
It also highlights how important culture is to community organizing, and the inclusion of dance and music and food too is a key element in helping people connect and feel comfortable and feel like they're welcome and that their experiences are being valued.
We actually did a whole program about the Manitos Project, by the way. And hearing you talk about what you tried to do with that project in New Mexico is making me think about what you both said in the earlier segment about equity. I think Ellen and I keep hearing this with a lot of the guests we've had and the topics we've covered. We keep hearing this theme running through it over and over again, where people claim ownership of, I guess, John, what you call cultural memory, and the efforts by people like you to create those ownership opportunities?
It's a question of why do you collect? And I do think that the Western European model of a museum or a library archive is really extractive in its methodology. You know, one of the things that I learned, I learned so much in many years of working with the tribal communities, some of these projects like this, there is that it's who's it for? And all the time when you have an academic coming to write a book, they think they're doing somebody this favor to collect the story. And it's not for them, it's not for that community. And they're actually the ones getting paid a salary, they're getting paid to be there, you know. One of the things that always surprised me is we were looking at digital tools to help record stories and really better understand the motivations of these just from a design perspective. There was a librarian at one of the Pueblo community libraries, and she was telling us the story about these amazing oral histories that they had collected. And she was just kind of matter-of-factly telling us what they were. And I was like, that's amazing. Where can I find those online? And she just looked at me and said, you can't find them online. And I was like, where can I get them? Do you not know how to use YouTube? And she was like, I know how to use YouTube, but they're not going on there. That's not who they're for. They're for us. So if you want to hear them, you can come ask us, you know. And it was just that kind of realization that not everything that we create should necessarily be open to everyone.
There have been times when revealing that knowledge has damaged the community.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of Indigenous communities are painfully aware of what harm can be done by people thinking that somebody has an obligation to tell their story or to have their story shared. I'm curious what you all talk about in your process for building community engagement and building equity in these institutions. You're talking about a very intimate and authentic approach where people come together and share and can work together in a sustained and meaningful way. How has the pandemic changed all this? Are there new opportunities, or has it made it more difficult to create these sort of authentic connections?
I think that's a multi-layered question. So there are opportunities to have conversations with audiences that we already have trust relationships with. So we have easily converted some programming to digital, but in cultivating new audiences to have a very vulnerable conversation about race, equity, and identity, we are still nuancing that and figuring that out. One of my other side lives, I am also the chair of an organization called Alternate Roots, which serves at the intersection of arts and social justice as an artist support organization. So, because of the exposure from that group, I've learned a lot of facilitation strategies, even online, to make that process feel more open and spacious. But this time is also creating a unique opportunity for people wanting to learn and engage in the conversation, like I said earlier, in a way that people were resistant to before. And so I think we need to leverage this moment to continue to have those conversations. And possibly we could reach people that we wouldn't even reach before because there's perception of danger in downtown because it's urban, which is a code word for Black. So we can reach people that don't feel safe coming downtown and they can experience this programming and these engagement with art objects. The challenge for us is to really figure out how to film an object in various angles so people can get the experience. And that experience will never mimic the in-person experience. But as we are getting ready for our public opening, we will have time tickets. I mean, people will be able to get into the museum, but we won't have any public programming probably until next year, until 2021. So it's something that we're like prototyping and say, okay, this worked, this didn't work, let's do it this way. Like I said, I think this time is an opening for these conversations.
Monique, do you think there's also an opportunity there, given your desire to have people sort of get into potentially deep conversations and engagements on topics that are tense? That by having virtual interactions and or viewings of some of these kinds of artworks or community created content, that there's something about the intimacy of being at home alone, no distractions perhaps. You're almost in your own little safe space to have these sorts of engagements. Do you think it's possible that that's something that could be leveraged in a positive way with these new digital platforms and virtual platforms?
I think so. I mean, I am a hippie born a generation late. So for me, there's nothing that replaces the energy of being in a room with other humans. But for some people that are digital natives and a generation younger than me, might be perfectly comfortable. And this is something that they prefer and open to that possibility.
Can you give us an example of one of those and what you're doing?
So the one that we moved relatively quickly is Art and Coffee, and it is a casual conversation about art with a community member or a subject area expert that happens at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. So really that was perfect. I told people, hey, stay in your pajamas, bring your cup of coffee, get on the Zoom link, and let's talk about some art. It is really lighthearted. We don't use museum terms. It's a very layperson friendly. We don't talk about perspective and saturation and all of these things that intimidate people about museums. Usually we go into the gallery or the virtual gallery and say, hey, talk about the piece and why you like it in whatever way resonates with you. And then the community has an open discussion about what they feel about it. And people feel excited to participate. And so we had maybe about 15, 20 people, which is about the same size as our regular audience. It's an intimate group and lots of regulars. So that one was relatively easy. Another experiment that's coming up is in celebration of Pride Month, and we're going to have a keynote. We're going to have somebody walk us through how to make a cocktail. We're going to have Miss Mississippi drag queen and go through maybe like a makeup demonstration. So all of that, we're in the process of figuring out how to do in a Zoom-based platform. But this one's supposed to be fun and as interactive as we can make it. The last one we did was really the quickest that we've ever done a program at the museum. And it was in response to the George Floyd murder. And it was an artistic response that centered the voices of 4 local poets and then also featured a painting that one of our local artists did of George Floyd. And so this was just our way to have a healing moment for our community about a way to process the grief and the trauma of this present moment.
That's fantastic. And I'm like you. I like the energy of a live event of any kind, but it seems like there's some real opportunities here to do some new things, but also, like you were saying earlier, to potentially reach people that wouldn't have gone out otherwise for whatever reason.
I'm curious if you see providing virtual or asynchronous experiences as a new part of the work that museum professionals do. You know, sometimes digital humanists feel like they're on the outside looking in because their work is not considered core or central to their institution's mission. Do you see that shifting?
I do. I don't see us going back to ever just being analog and just a live event. We'll adapt and there will always be a digital component. The thing is like getting our staff capacity up to have the technical expertise to edit, to know what a good shot is, and just all of those pieces.
As somebody who's been in the digital world for a long time and with a technical background, I thought one of the things that was most interesting when COVID happened and all the conferences were canceled was how quick people were to adapt to those. And I think that there were 2 sides of that. One was really questioning what the true value is of these types of conferences. And I find that the smaller ones tend to be actually much more valuable, much more intentional. The other is sort of barriers that a lot of accessibility proponents have called out for a long, long time that suddenly were removed, that there were these virtual gatherings that were actually much more accessible to people than they were before. That is a really exciting development. The future of gatherings like this is going to be important. Like instead of having 20,000 person convention, what does it mean to have 50 or 100 people together? Could that be a much more high quality experience? I've found that it is, for sure.
Speaking of intimate and authentic engagement, right?
Absolutely.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
John, you've started a lot of important conversations with an article that you wrote recently about the future of museums. You wrote, technological solutions can certainly help us get together in times when physical proximity is not an option, but they also have their limits. As we come back to digital solutions and get creative with how we connect and engage our audiences, now is a perfect time to build for equity and access for as wide of a range of people as possible. In your work, Monique and John, what does that look like?
It's so interesting to think back on. That was 3 weeks ago or so that I wrote that. It could be years ago, and it seemed quaint, really, to think about what was possible. One of the most important factors that I had in mind then was the opportunity for these more intimate and authentic experiences, and how we do that specifically with everyone in mind. So, to be clear, I wasn't just talking about museums, I was talking about cultural memory writ large. So, my colleague Burgess Jules often talks about community-based archives, these organizations that are rooted in community but still hold cultural memory. Thinking about just how funds are distributed is a really key element to this. When we looked at the month after the pandemic and how things would be supported and distributed, it's a perfect time to address the inequity in funding to those smaller organizations. When we build technological interventions, ways for us to connect, we talk about Zoom. A lot of us take that for granted, but a lot of people don't have connectivity, they don't have that option. So it's another time to address the potential for these cultural organizations and cultural institutions to be gateways of access. We've already seen a lot of libraries nationwide offer hotspots, for instance. If you look at New Mexico, broadband access is an enormous issue there. And so how can you do distance learning if you don't have broadband access? So we really have to look at some of the policy issues around this, and now's the time to revisit this. Cultural organizations, libraries, archives, museums alike are in a great position to actually service those needs and address those needs for their constituents. But then you add to it everything else that's going on. Now we really can talk about the depth of suffering, the depth of inequity that we need to face, and what that looks like.
How do you affect this change? I mean, how do you shift your organization to prioritizing equity and access? From the inside or from the outside?
From the inside, it can get to be complicated because you're balancing the safety needs of COVID with the realities of being able to give people access to your learning platforms. And to be honest with you, we haven't quite figured that out yet. A couple of things that we have done in response is we've given over 200 catalogs to senior centers so they could have summer enrichment activities. And the artist on our staff is going to do a adult coloring book for the senior centers to follow up. We are partnering with our school system to do some programming on their public access channel in just really short bursts, maybe 5 to 15 minute activities that will live on YouTube, which is more accessible because most people have cable, but it still doesn't entirely address the access issue. And I think this is something that we have to do in collaboration with our other community partners and stakeholders, and not something we can really address on our own. But we are aware that this is often a barrier for our visitors in our community to access learning materials.
Or to have the technology, even, especially in rural communities.
One of the things that I've found really interesting in working in cultural memory over the last 10 years or so is that I've noticed when buildings close down for like a 2-year remodel or something like that, it really causes institutions to self-reflect. Because if your building's closed, what actually are you doing for the community, or how are you serving the community? And oftentimes programs will really evolve and come back stronger, more dynamic, more connected than they were before.
Does Shift Collective sort of encourage that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something that we do in terms of this community-centered engagement, community-centered design, is taking these opportunities. It's based on a human-centered design approach, but essentially listening, coming to an understanding of what the needs are of a community, co-designing potential solution or set of solutions, prototyping those, trying them out, understanding what worked, what didn't work, and then reiterating on that and doing that as a community. For instance, you may have a house museum that's had this kind of walk through, look at how the people lived 100 years ago in this fancy rich person's house, and then, see what you take away from that. But what does it look like to bring a production like Goat in the Road Productions, which happened at the Louisiana State Museum? They brought in this amazing lived narrative of the complexity of race and class in New Orleans during a pandemic, or in that case, an epidemic of the yellow fever. And then you have dialogue opportunities around that. You have the ability to look at that. And I think those are the kinds of opportunities that we look to help bring to life across the board.
When we were out in Hawaii, we were asked to come in as consultants on a couple of house museums where the funders or the donors really were pushing back against making available any kind of narrative besides, here's the beautiful house and the wonderful rich people who lived here. There's this huge tension between the funders and the needs of the community and actually the staff at both places.
You really, to me, call out something that I've noticed so explicitly is the role of staff being on the community-facing side, knowing that they need to tell these stories, knowing that there needs to be something bigger than this, and the boards and the funders who are trying to keep that one narrative to be told. All I can hope is that's going to be a generational shift, that's going to be something that changes. To me, it has to be forced from the outside.
You said something that really struck me about, in some ways, some of this may be generational. I know that with the protests happening over the last number of weeks, as of this recording, that you would see certain perspectives which were accurate from major media that might be covering a given protest on the ground. And that would be very, very different from what a lot of the young people were posting directly to their Instagram accounts. And I would sort of see this almost happening in real time. They'd say, look, the local news station just showed this, but here's what we're all seeing. Is that sort of what you mean, is that the up and coming digital generations may just sort of almost take it not for granted, but they will presume that there is community ownership of a mediated narrative? Is that kind of what you mean by a generational shift?
Well, I think for one thing, young people today have way more tools at their disposal to talk about race and gender and class than I had. And then when you look at the average board age of your typical historical house museum, you're talking about leap years. One of the things that surprised me is seeing monuments being torn down. Here in New Orleans, I've lived through the 5-year saga that it was to take 4 Confederate monuments down, and the death threats and the cover of darkness handled. And now we're at a point where the city council is talking about analyzing the 200 or so street names and sites that honor the Confederacy and making drastic changes to those. That's what I mean by generational.
I think with these historic home museums, I'm thinking about the defensiveness. My history wasn't that bad. I was one of the good ones. With this generational thing and the changes that are coming culturally, the changes that might be coming from staff who have different training and different foundation, how do you see people making these arguments without getting people defensive? And I think this goes back to what you guys are talking about with the engagement and allowing conversations. I mean, how do you structure a conversation conversation with people to keep them from getting defensive about wanting to protect their heritage or what they see as their heritage?
I think that's where you have an agreed set of ground rules. You can call them norms or community agreements that everybody agrees to, and you start from there. And, I have like three or four: speak from your own personal experience, use I statements, and then I have what I call a given. This is something that's not up for debate, that racism exists. So we are not going to debate that that's not a fact. The other one is assume good intent, but acknowledge impact. And so while people might be fumbling for words and be inarticulate in expressing something, you assume that they are coming from a good place, but you also have to acknowledge that if they say something, then you have to name it and say, okay, then a perception of what you have said might have been seen as offensive, and this is why. And that's when a good facilitator or somebody who's trained in doing these activities and knows how to manage the room is really key to that. And then there needs to be just some grounding in history and facts. There are such a thing as fact, and
What are
there's
these facts of which you speak?
there are facts and there are truths. There's data, there's science. You have to create kind of like a shared statement of what the understoods are, what the facts are, so you all can move on from there. When people have that conversation about heritage, and I'm one of the good ones, for me, that's one of the most dangerous conversations to have.
Dangerous why?
Because there's nothing more dangerous than somebody who thinks they understand everything already. There's nothing more dangerous than somebody who thinks they have nothing else to learn. Racism is something that we're all learning and unlearning, and equity is a practice. And you don't become not racist in one day after one diversity training, after looking at one piece of art. It is an ongoing, lifelong practice that we have to unearth this white body supremacy that's ingrained in our culture. Our country was started with two sins: we stole land and we stole people. And until we have honest conversations about that and begin to name those two things, then we won't be able to move together in some form of unity. And so this uprising is a reflection of the 400 years of oppression that stemmed from that one original sin. And I think we almost need something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, like they had in South Africa. And people need to name their pain. And we all need to acknowledge that all of these things that we see are built on the backs of people.
Well, and it speaks to what you were saying before, which is even acknowledging that these are facts
Right.
because they actually happened. I mean, the history is there. We have all the records of it, but there's still some people that almost want to doubt the fact of it itself.
This is the powerful role that cultural heritage, cultural memory has to play. There's a requirement to look at those original sins, but also to look at how we got to where we are today. It didn't happen by accident. These are facts. This is history. And unless we face those things, we really don't have much of a chance to really move out and to really experience ourselves as the humans that we are.
I think that's one of the great disservices of our public education system. And I gave my children Howard Zinn's History of the People, and I just think that should be a seminal book in every school system. And even the system of creating the books that come from one publishing house in Texas that said that slaves were migrant labor. I mean, just the insidiousness of us trying to assuage this guilt and make ourselves feel comfortable about history and causing us to reframe it in a way that's not true is doing a disservice to all of us.
When you involve people with these community programs around art, you've talked about a couple of light bulb moments that people had around race identity or immigration. Do you find that they stay engaged?
There's an interesting tension in the museum world. There are people that want to come to the museum and have a contemplative experience where they see things that make them feel comfortable and loved and appreciated and affirmed. They don't want to necessarily critically think about their role in perpetuating white supremacy. And then you have people that want to have lifelong learning, that want to be provoked into thinking differently. And then there's an intersection of the middle. And so, how do we navigate those audiences? It's a very nuanced tango that we're doing to try to figure out how to do that work in a way that honors all of these people. I mean, we should honor the visitor that just wants to come and see pretty things, but also across from that pretty thing should be something that gets people to think critically about their role in the world and to see other people's humanity. And so it's a balance.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
I guess I wanted to start by talking a little bit about your concept of an open ecosystem of historical data. I know earlier we talked about extractive memory collection. Does an open ecosystem of historical data move us away from an extractive model? What does that look like?
That's something that I really started thinking about back in 2008 or so when we were looking at linked open data. And that really was just a series of technical, legal, and cultural methods, particularly with public institutions, to share their content. I think we've made a lot of progress in that space where we were then, as developers and technologists, were just asking for metadata to be open so that we could build the apps that drive things like History Pin. Since then, the legal vehicles have changed quite a bit. We had Creative Commons to work with then. And there are now particularly rights statements that Digital Public Library of America, Europeana, and other aggregators like that make it a lot easier for institutions to share that kind of content. The question is, what do we do with that? We've certainly seen in the last couple of months a real uptick in the use of historypin.org, which is really about building community around local history. We've seen a lot of classrooms going to that and using it. A lot of people mapping some of the content from protest campuses or around the country. There's also the ethics of that kind of open data and open shared historical data. And one of the projects that we work on, led by Burgess Jules, my colleague, the Documenting the Now project, which is really about archiving social media history as it unfolds and doing it in a way that's ethical and focused on protection of the people who are preserving these stories and doing it in coordination with them, which to me is a massive change in how archiving works. Like, instead of just picking what we archive, working with people to understand the risks of archiving, particularly protest movements, but also to do it in a way that they're training on how to do that. They're archiving it for their own purposes in a way that can't be used by police forces, etc.
You brought up two things I hadn't even thought of, which is the archiving of social media, which, unlike something like archive.org that just indexes every website that it can find, a lot of social media is accessible content only in certain contexts, but also that if you are going to archive that and can get access to it, that could really come back to haunt you in all sorts of ways.
What we saw in Ferguson is that 7 of the main organizers of the Ferguson protests are now dead due to suspicious circumstances. So this is really a matter of life and death when people are sharing these photos. When you saw the monument on University of North Carolina's campus taken down, the images posted on social media were used to prosecute people who were involved in that protest. And that's what the Documenting the Now project is about. Shift is a partner in that, as well as University of Maryland and University of Virginia. There's an entire community of people who are working on that project to really train not only in the technical elements of it, but the ethical elements in it as well.
We were talking with people working with indigenous communities. A lot of the people who are doing that kind of work are using Mercadoo as a platform because the communities themselves get to decide what gets shared or what gets protected or what might be open to specific groups or not. Are there analogs with the work that you're doing in Documenting the Now?
There's a couple elements of that. One is that a lot of the tactics in organizing is using social media just for getting people to the right places and understanding what's happening in one place, Craig, you talked about it earlier when you're getting one narrative from the authorities and you're getting another narrative from the people on the ground, and we actually have evidence of that. Our phones are our best forms of defense to see what is really happening. So there's certainly methodologies involved there. There's also a sense of asking permission so that it's not just record, harvest everything, but actually ask people their permission. You may think you're helping by posting all these things, but make sure that you're understanding the risks that are there as well.
If someone tags my face on Facebook or whatever, I get very unhappy about it. It's
Yeah.
like, I don't need facial recognition running on every image.
Yeah, I agree. I actually listened to a talk yesterday from one of the top 4 accounting agencies, and she was asked like what technical skills students should be having a good understanding of as they go into that. And I was shocked to hear her say facial recognition as a critical tool in something that would be used for auditing. I don't know.
There's also some really interesting data that shows how the technology is not able to recognize Afrocentric features and how they lump similar features together. So this goes back to how embedded systems of oppression are, that there's not even enough time built into when they're designing the software to distinguish between one set of features and another. White supremacy is used as a standard, and everything else is an other or a deviant from the main programming. And so this next area of work is going to have to be interrogating those digital systems, even in the words that we spell check. It's from a Eurocentric point of view. We still have to question these systems, even when it evolves into this next iteration of technology in a digital environment.
Who's having these conversations besides the two of you? Who is doing the work to sort of surface these problems in the systems and to address changing them?
Ruha Benjamin is a professor that operates out of Princeton that's doing a lot of work around digital activism. Allied Media is also a good source that's doing some progressive work around democratizing media platforms. And I'm sure there's many others, but those are the two that come to mind off the top of my head.
But I mean, like the Museum Association, are there big umbrella cultural organizations that are starting to have these conversations?
Oh, Ellen, you're going to have me fall to something that John said earlier. And so often museums are not at the forefront of technology. Even conversations about equity based digital practices is something that we haven't gotten to yet. We are still trying to diversify our collections, create programming, and the practices that I'm excited about as a new equity inclusion officer at my museum is in identifying vendor relationships. How do we enter business relationships with people? What's the metric? How do we choose? Do we look at their board? Do we look at their staff? Is that a metric that we evaluate whether this is a good business partner? How do we live into the values that we say we have as an institution? And how is that reflected in our budgets? That's the internal practices that we have to do to be authentic in communicating out. We have to do it externally with our audience, but we also have to do it within us, within our staff. We have to be models of the behavior that we want to spread out.
Monique, when you were just saying that, I was thinking, are you also going in the reverse? Are you potentially looking at your funding sources and evaluating, say, their boards where they get their money from? Or are you under the same pressures, I hate to say, that many cultural institutions are under, which is you need to take the money where you can find it? Does that make sense?
So it makes sense, Craig, but I have an interesting position on that. My view is all money's dirty.
Okay.
All money's dirty because it came from slaves and indigenous people. And my job is to raise the energy vibration of the money.
Okay.
So let's use the money for good.
So you're cleaning it.
We're cleaning it. I mean, there are examples where the offense is really egregious, but that has not been our experience. We get funding from the typical museum funding sources, and they have the typical American story, and that money comes from where it comes from. And so I view myself as a conduit to redistribute and do good with the money.
That's one way to sort of elevate what you're doing with the money.
When you talk about money that's going into arts and culture, it is looking at the white supremacist roots of that as well. And what is this structure in which people avoided taxes in the Gilded Age, created their version of what should be funded and how that should look, as opposed to doing that in a democratic process. So what's also happened over the last couple of years is 4 or 5 books have come out really looking at the problems with philanthropy as it's structured.
Yeah, it's called Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. It's a really excellent book about the accumulated wealth and the inequities. I mean, as John's mentioned, and we've alluded to, even museums are based on an exploitative, extractive, colonial model that we have to reconfigure and reimagine what that is. And so it's a bunch of people that stole other people's stuff and say, hey, look at all this stuff I stole. Isn't it cool? And so we have to reconstruct that. We have to highlight the narratives that haven't been highlighted in the past. We have to interrogate why the Western European canon is a model that's revered, and we call this other art folk art or primitive art or outsider art. And those are valid conversations to have.
And at the same time, if we're going to say that we value equity, that we value other cultures, all those other museums exist, right? So there are organizations and museums that are by people of color, for people of color, that need the funding.
Just thinking about conversational spaces, I have a bad Twitter addiction, and
As opposed to a good Twitter addiction?
I have seen a lot of these conversations blossom on Twitter where somebody from an institution sees their institution's statement about Black Lives Matter or the George Floyd murder or the protests and blows up the conversation about this is what organization looks like internally. Not just museums, but libraries too. I'm sorry to say, and really pulls all this out into the public. I mean, in your eyes, is that a useful area to surface these discussions if that's where they're happening?
I'm not part of the Twitterverse. I guess if people are illuminated or if they learn some new information, I think the issue for me is authenticity and integrity. And if you are not doing the things that back up your statement, then it's going to come out. And, I'm going to lean on my old Catholic guilt roots. Whatever is in the dark will come to light at some point. And so you need to align your actions with your mission and your integrity, and that's going to come out. And that's an ongoing practice. So you just can't say, oh, yes, we do this, we're anti-racist, and then nobody on your leadership team is a person of color.
It's hard for it not to ring hollow in a museums field that is 87% white, and with the disparity in salaries between directors and security personnel or other front of house. And I think that's what's been becoming clear in this. It is on Twitter for this statement to be there. It's an aspirational thing, and it's something that these organizations can be held accountable to as well, and that those on the inside can use as a way to leverage.
This is an accountability moment. This is also one of the reasons why I push to have, when we reinstall our permanent collection, to have pictures of the artist underneath the didactic so we could have accountability and people could see who is part of our permanent collection. Because if we are saying that we represent this community, then our collection and our collection policies and practices need to reflect the community. For me, it enhances it because as a person of color wanting to know what your practices are, I want to see who's part of your collection and what your collection strategy is.
I'd love to see pictures of the artists underneath all the work, by the way. That would be really interesting.
It adds a whole new dimension to the experience, doesn't it?
Well, this has just been an unbelievably interesting discussion. I can't thank you enough, John and Monique, for being with us. If you would like more information about Shift Collective, visit shiftcollective.us. For more information about the Center for Art and Public Exchange, visit museumcape.org. Augmented Humanity is a program of the New Mexico Humanities Council produced in partnership with KUNM-FM. You can visit us online and find out more about our programs at nmhumanities.org. Our theme music comes courtesy James Whiten, and we've had production assistance from Tristan Klum.